Hybrid Cloud Show, Episode 7. I'm Aaron.
I'm Gary.
I'm Sean.
And I'm Shane.
Welcome to the show about public cloud, private cloud, and everything in between. Our views here are ours and not those of our employers. So I wanted to take a minute to crawl into all of your server cabinets and ask you a little bit about what you are doing in your houses and how or if you are tying that into anything hybrid, or if your dirty secret is that you keep your work and personal lives separate.
You leave my server cabinet alone. I keep my home lab relatively simple. And I say simple, as in it's not particularly cloudy, I guess. Because I guess, like Aaron said, I don't like to mix the work and home stuff too much. So my home lab is very traditional infrastructure. So on premises, there are, I think, 2 Proxmox boxes, both Intel N100. There's a Synology that stuff gets backed up to. And then in the cloud, quote unquote, I've got a dedicated server I rent at OVH, which is also running Proxmox. So other than that, and like a site-to-site VPN between them, it's not particularly cloudy at all. The workloads are all just running on a mixture of Ubuntu and Fedora server, standalone Docker stuff. I handle the failover at the hypervisor level rather than running Kubernetes or anything like that. So it's actually pretty straightforward, to be honest.
What's the Proxmox for on the OVH box? Is that on a bare metal node, or is it?
Yeah, sorry, I should have said, yeah. It's an older bare metal node that came on sale a couple of Black Fridays ago at OVH. So it's an old Sandy Bridge or Ivy Bridge Xeon with 32 gigs of RAM and 2 2TB spinning Rust disks in a RAID 1. So it's slow, but it's also 20 quid a month. And that's a lot of storage and compute for 20 quid a month. And I can deal with the fact the storage is a little bit lackluster on it for that price, to be honest.
I think in terms of most amateur, I'll definitely take that award. So what I've got is based on a recommendation I heard somewhere, a Dell Wise box, and that is running a bunch of Docker containers. What I have is basically one massive Docker Compose file that pretty much just vends out everything, like all my various things for downloading Linux ISOs, things like Home Assistant and a couple of other apps I can't even remember. So that's there at home doing its thing. I've got a box on Hetzner. I've got a new job and I'm learning Kubernetes. So I'm using this Hetzner box to like trial out Kubernetes stuff right now. So I've got kind of a nice setup with K3S and been figuring out and having some fun with that. And then I've also got an AWS set of accounts set up with Terraform. And that's for doing all the things I want to play around with in AWS, but without trashing my company's AWS accounts in them. Because I'll do a lot of like organizational fun stuff. Like I'll try mess around with service control policies. The things I'd be really scared to do at my job, I will muck around within that. And then lots of billing alerting so I don't get stung for a couple £100, which I have been done before. So yeah, that's pretty much it. It's just stuff I need to run and things I want to play around with.
Congrats on the new job, man. That's awesome. Are you doing a lot of Kubernetes stuff in your new job?
Yes, I will be. It will be a lot of Kubernetes and a lot of extending Kubernetes with Go, which I'm also learning.
So you'll be eradicating Kubernetes from any of your home lab stuff soon because you'll just be sick to the death of it. Right?
Probably.
If we're giving out awards for home labs, then mine would be Overkill. I'll take that award. My main servers, I have 3 Proxmox nodes. One's a R720 with 32 cores, 64 gigabytes of RAM. And then I have 2 630s that are 32 core, 128 gigabytes of RAM. And they all run Proxmox. They're all clustered. They each have, I think, 3 1 terabyte drives inside of them for self-storage between them all. And then on top of them, I am running not 1, but 2 Kubernetes clusters because I hate myself. No, because I've been trying to learn about Kubernetes administration, and I've had 1 Kubernetes cluster for about 3-4 years. And so now I'm trying to experiment with stuff like, what does Fleet look like? What does Crossplane look like? If I'm going to run Argo CD across multiple clusters, what does that look like? So trying to get those administrative controls in place. It is absolutely overkill, but it powers all of my stuff. I have 1 cluster right now for my public stuff. So things I have that are on the internet, like Nextcloud and Image and all those other services that kind of need to be on the internet. And then I have a private Kubernetes cluster, and that has stuff like Home Assistant. I had a GitLab instance. I don't know. I have a lot of things. And so that's how I kind of keep them all separate. But if anybody has any ideas for things to try out or experiment with, please let me know, because I'm looking for new projects.
Mine's a pretty filthy Frankenstein setup that's grown over far too many years. So had a box that used to be connected to the TV once upon a time to do Mythbuntu and all of those sort of analog TV transcoding and all of that stuff back before TV went digital. And then over very, very many years, that's sort of grown into server roles and taken on new storage and hardware and been replaced several times. But the genesis of it means that it's always been based on a general purpose operating system. And then I've increased the storage and all of those bits. So after reading some or listening to some podcast somewhere, I got into ZFS and ended up reading a book on ZFS, which I will plug for Alan because it was the most interesting book on a file system I've ever read. That doesn't say that much, admittedly, but it was a very good book on a file system. And so, yeah, I've got my whole ZFS set up and the data set's going off to, basement box in a friend's house and all those sorts of normal things. But on top of that, I'm using LexD for my virtualization. I've always liked that because it's a very cloudy sort of feel. And so you launch images on that in the same sort of way that you launch a cloud image, as opposed to sort of installing an operating system. And that's always been quite a nice feel to it for me. So I've got a bunch of virtual machines and LexC containers sitting on top of that in my server and running things like Pi-hole and Jellyfin with actually legitimate Blu-ray rips. So I've got some ridiculously large Blu-ray rips that I have the discs for and play through Jellyfin, and that is more fun than it sounds.
Me too, yeah.
Yeah, of course.
Absolutely.
And how are you all doing networking? Are you all Tailscale or... I've got a Nebula set up, so I think it was Jim who recommended it on 2.5 admins, but it's a bit like Tailscale, but you tend to run your own. They call it a lighthouse, but it's the thing that has the public IP, and then everything else goes from there. And I got into it before they had their hosted offering, so it involved setting up a certificate authority, effectively, and you've got your certificate authority that you've got to renew every year or two or extend the certificates on. And otherwise, I think it runs basically the same as Tailscale otherwise.
Man, this is where I out myself as the real Phelim of this show. I don't have any kind of Tailscale or any of that stuff set up. I did used to, but what I found was I didn't like not being in complete control of the way the networking worked. And I had all sorts of weird things like CPU spikes when I was trying to transfer stuff over the local network, but it was instead going via Tailscale and things like that. So right now, all of the networking in this house is all Unify stuff for switches and access points. The firewall is a Wisebox running pfSense. And then any kind of VPN stuff is just WireGuard into pfSense. And then in OVH, there's another pfSense box and just a site-to-site VPN between the two. I have experimented recently with a couple of Cloudflare tunnels coming in to kind of start looking at their zero trust stuff, because I think it would be quite nice to eliminate the need for VPN altogether, even for the private stuff, and looking at how the OAuth tie-in works with G Suite and those kind of things, which is quite cool, but I haven't actually pushed migrate on anything that I care about quite yet.
I got burned very early on by some not very nice person on the internet. So I exposed a PHP form thing to let people upload photos to me from some event and left it not properly secured and had punched a hole in my home network to let people get access to this thing. And somebody started trawling through all of my personal documents and stuff. I felt quite violated by the end of it. So I've been very, very nervous ever since about opening ports into my personal infrastructure, and from there use things like Nebula on phones and so forth to access the stuff that I consider to be, my private network, even if I'm not at the house.
Yeah, for me, I've made a pretty distinct rule that nothing from my house is public. The only public stuff is from the OVH box, and there's a second IP with a second pfSense instance on it, and everything kind of sits in its own isolated Proxmox network for anything that's public. because I just can't be dealing with it. And that's actually part of the reason that I deal with all of the VM backup and failover at the host level, because it means I don't have to worry about any of the networking between my on-prem stuff and my cloud stuff for backups. So it's a very deliberate choice, I think, to keep it separate. If I were to expose any of that stuff, it'd probably be behind like the Cloudflare tunnel or something with the G Suite auth in front of it, because they can probably do auth a lot better than I can.
If you have some Unify stuff already, Gary, then why don't you use the built-in like WireGuard tunnel there instead of using pfSense?
Because then I'd have to have a Unify Edge device, and those are A, really expensive, and B, in my experience, not particularly reliable for the two that I've had that have lasted a couple of years and burnt themselves out. So I've tried to keep it like very generic open source stuff at the edge, because I'm kind of comfortable with it and I like managing it. And then just the rest of the networking was an investment I'd already made when I was using a USG at the edge. So I kept that stuff around and just ran the controller myself.
That's pretty high praise if you ask me. Saying I like managing something, that's high praise.
I guess I either like managing pfSense or I've done it for long enough that I've learned to live with it. Probably the latter, to be honest.
Stockholm Syndrome.
I always wanted to try OpenSense or pfSense or one of those ones, and I've fiddled around with bits and pieces, but never pushed the button on actually replacing my home networking with it, in large part because most stuff that I dink with on my home network or home server is stuff that if it breaks, I don't get yelled at. And I'm a bit worried that if I started putting the household internet through something that I was managing, that there's more risk than I can deal with there.
I mean, the ISP router is there and has like the right networks and stuff configured on it, so I could just move the cables over if I ever needed to. But at this point, that pfSense has been running for at least a year or two, I think. And the box that predated it was even longer than that. And that, again, is a Wise box. So another plug for those. It just has a second NIC in what would have been the Wi-Fi card slot. And then it has a little ribbon cable that goes across to where the VGA port would have originally mounted. So 2 physical NICs in it as well, which is quite nice.
Yeah, I've pretty much just got Tailscale everywhere. It's dead easy to use. I also quite like a lot of the functionality. It's got like Next DNS integration for all my devices. And it's also got a VPN egress, so I can hook this up to Mullvad. So all my local connections can talk to all my local devices, but everything to the internet is over Mullvad, which is pretty nice considering the UK government and the whole snooper charter thing.
I went the opposite direction. I had a requirement when I bought my house that I needed a doorbell system that was going to be super easy. I said Apple easy for my wife because she's not technical. And the only real contender that I found was the Unify system. So I bought a UDM Pro, Unified Dream Machine Pro, and then a couple of months after I bought it, they came out with the WireGuard integration natively, so I didn't have to like do any kind of KMod stuff to it, and that's what I run. And so when I'm out, away from my home, I just have my VPN on, comes right back to my stuff. I have access to all of my stuff, no problem. And honestly, it's worked pretty flawlessly. Would recommend.
Is that a dedicated box you've got in the house now for running Unify, the WireGuard instance?
Yeah, the UDM Pro is a dedicated instance, and that's where it controls the Protect, which is for my security doorbell, and my Wi-Fi network access points and everything. It's all just one big box. I wanted open source, but I couldn't find anything that was going to pass the wife approval factor. So here we are.
Pulling the conversation back a little bit, Sean, you talked about some of the things you've played with Kubernetes. I'm just wondering, was there any technology you've picked up that was quite helpful for the home lab setup? I'm tempted to move my shoddy set of Docker Compose scripts to Kubernetes, but if there's any like fancy nice tools that like make administering these a bit easier, I'd be curious to know.
As I started to learn Kubernetes, I really liked Rancher. Rancher was a really quick, easy way to give a UI. It gives you a way to shell in to your pods and run commands. It gives you the logs right there. Very click-opsy, but very good for getting started. And then as I've become more of an expert on Kubernetes, I now find myself limited by Rancher, and I will usually use another tool, preferably K9S or just kubectl, however you want to call it, and just run with that. And that has been flawless.
Yeah, that's what I've been using at the moment, but I find I've not got the muscle memory for like shelling into stuff easily. I find it a bit cumbersome, so maybe I'll chuck in Rancher in there and see what what it's like, just to make life a little easier for now while I'm figuring things out.
I guess it depends a little on whether you are using it as an excuse to learn Kubernetes or whether you're doing it to get a Kubernetes and not have to worry about it.
That was definitely part of the equation when I started. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I guess if you're replacing your home lab stuff, which, let's be clear, there's probably not much of a distinction for the four of us between home lab and home production at this point. You probably just want something that's going to work, right, and that's easy to look after, which I think is probably why I've strayed away from anything that's complex to manage, because I don't want to get screamed at when suddenly the TV doesn't work and my kid can't watch Bluey for the 15th time today or something.
Yeah, and it's why I've never done Kubernetes for my containers at home, just because I've got a single node anyway. So the additional complexity of making a multi-node setup for a single node server at home didn't seem worthwhile.
Yeah, I used to run OpenShift at home when I was running it at work. And I think maybe there's like a dichotomy there between like, I use it all day at work, so I kind of understand how it works, and I'm knee deep in using it anyway. So if something breaks at work, I can test it at home, or if something breaks at home, I can make sure we're not going to fall foul of the same thing at work. So I think there probably is benefit if you're running Kubernetes a lot of work to understanding that. I guess at this point for me, it's like I'm a couple of steps removed from running things in production. So I just want something that's easy to look after at home and doesn't give me a headache in the evening, or more importantly, doesn't make my wife sit and say, why are you running patches on a server in the evening while we're trying to watch TV?
Yeah, that would definitely be my pro tip, is to try and get as many of the things that you play with out of the sort of critical household path as possible. It was one of the big reasons that I moved away from the box connected directly to the TV to a more kind of client-server architecture for TV viewing, because at least if I accidentally take out the Jellyfin server, then you can still watch iPlayer or Live TV or the other bits. They're a little bit more separate and fail separately.
Oh man, putting something like an Apple TV next to each of the TVs that's just completely consumer grade and I don't have to think about patching or updating or anything else, it's just been a game changer. Like all the Raspberry Pis that were under the TV, now in a drawer, and there they shall remain.
Right. Separations of concerns, right? If my Proxmox cluster goes down, my home network is fine because it's all done on the Unified Dream Express, right? I'm not going to take anything down, right? Home Assistant goes down, not a problem. It's running on a Raspberry Pi. It's not going to affect anything else, right? Making sure you have those, my NAS. My NAS has like my Plex and stuff inside of it. That way, if my compute goes down, it's still going and I don't get yelled at by my kids. So separation of concerns.
Similarly, I also have my mail server on infrastructure that is on Linode rather than something that I run, because I want to make sure that keeps going. And I actually use Grafana's free plan thing. So you have the Grafana agent on each of the machines, and then it pulls the metrics up into Grafana, and you can then set up alerts and do all of your monitoring. And that was a very deliberate decision as well. I wanted to use the sort of Grafana suite of logging, monitoring, and alerting because that's what I've touched before. And it was a very deliberate decision not to run that on my own infrastructure, or you get into that whole Latin who watches the watchers thing. And so, yeah, the idea was have somebody do that as a SaaS so that I know that if my mail server's down, I actually am going to still see some alerts about it.
Yeah, it's like those companies that run their status page on their own infrastructure so everything goes down. You want to avoid that. I want to roll back to you run your own mail server. How have you found that?
I've actually been running it for a very, very long time, and it's been fine. I use the mail in a box offering, and basically I only touch it unless I do something stupid. I leave it and it just runs, and I have to update it every second LTS or something, and otherwise it's just been fine. And I've had no issues with mail delivery or anything else really. Maybe it's because I've had the IP for so long that I'm not on any blacklists or anything like that, but it's been really good actually.
Yeah, that's encouraging. I've tried to run it before in the past, but I couldn't get an email to Gmail or whatever Microsoft's equivalent for Love Nor Money. Maybe it is having a safe IP.
Yeah, huge shout out to the person who maintains Mail in a Box. It has just been rock solid for so long.
Again, for me, it's wife acceptance factor. Like, I don't want to be responsible for people in my family not receiving emails. So I just make it Google's problem, frankly.
Nobody gets anything important by email anymore anyway. Time for some admin then. First of all, I want to say thank you to our existing PayPal supporters and patrons. If you want to join those people, you can at hybridcloudshow.com/support. And for various amounts on Patreon, you can get an ad-free feed of either just this show or all the Late Night Linux family shows. And sometimes you receive episodes early. We are still a new show, so please do keep sharing it around. We'd love to see the subscribers grow on it. And if you have any questions or feedback, please do send them to show@hybridcloudshow.com. Anton asks, how do you secure your cloud subscription superuser or admin account?
Above and beyond the obvious ways, which are make sure you've got a strong password with MFA, etc. My favorite way to do this is to just not have the credentials ever. So vend the account using organizations or Account Factory or something like that, and have it generate a random root password and a random set of MFA credentials that you throw away. Because for 99% of actions, you do not need access to the root user. Some kind of administrative access role that's very permissive on an admin account is fine for pretty much everything you need, other than closing the account and a couple of other notable exceptions. So for me, the best way to do this is set up an organization, vend accounts from the organization, and do not have the root credentials ever. And then you completely eliminate this problem from your life.
What I've done in the past, which is possibly not as extreme, but if anyone in any organization logs in as the root user, it's a security incident immediately, and that has to be responded to ASAP. But I would echo Gary's sentiment that there is no reason for you to be logging into the root account other than for a very, very minor set of actions. So it's probably your best way.
Gary's advice is very sound if you're doing anything at the enterprise level. That should be a standard practice, honestly. But let's pretend Anton isn't doing something at a giant enterprise. Maybe he has a startup or a small company, something that's not going to have Account Factory. What do you suggest?
Same advice applies. Create yourself an IAM user that has administrative access role. Throw away the root credentials. You do not need them. And if you need to log in as root, treat it as your own security exception and go through the root account recovery process. It's a painful process, but it means that your account is as secure as it can possibly be. I just don't buy that there is any reason other than closing the account you need root access, at which point you are probably at the point where you don't mind going in and doing the root account recovery. As long as you've got all of the contact information and everything set up correctly, then it's doable. And that would be my advice, is just keep that root account locked away, regardless of if it's an enterprise account vended through Account Factory or it's your own account. I promise you do not need the credentials in pretty much every single piece of day-to-day use.
So if you're creating an account that has sufficient privileges to do everything, can you spell out the advantage of getting rid of the root account?
Because the root account also has access to go and create other accounts that have that access, or close your account, or there's a whole bunch of administrative actions, and Anton didn't specify what cloud provider he's using, so I won't go into specifics, but there are quite a few things that root account can do that would spell game over for your account, and the risk of hijack if you've got access to that root account is way higher.
So then if you're trying to replicate that by creating other accounts instead, do you split up the roles to create other accounts from the other permissions in that account?
I think I would just follow principle of least privilege. Say, yeah, I would probably have an administrator account that isn't root, because then you're not using a well-known username. So that's going to reduce the amount of access somewhat. And then for your day-to-day use account, just create yourself a user or a role you assume via single sign-on or something with the minimum amount of privileges that you need to do things that you need to do day-to-day. It's the same kind of security advice that we've been telling people to follow for years and years on a Linux box or whatever. And I think the same applies here. Day to day, assume a role that only gives you access to what you need to do. You should not be logging in with allow star on all services as a general rule. And you'd be surprised how often you see that happen in the wild. Other things you can do are things like not having console access if you don't need it. Say, only have read-only access to the console is quite a common one that I see people do, and then using Terraform or something like that in order to provision and manage those resources. You can do that with a role you're assuming that just has CLI access in AWS's case. And then if, again, you need access to read-write the console, then use an account that has permissions to do that isn't the root user.
Right, well, we better get out of here then. If you've got any questions, please do send them in to show@hybridcloudshow.com, and we'll see you again in 2 weeks' time. Until then, I've been Aaron.
I've been Carrie.
I've been Sean.
And I've been Shane.
See you later.